The sun blazed mercilessly over the Afghan desert as Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison adjusted his tactical gear one final time. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, checking each piece of equipment that might mean the difference between life and death in the next few hours. The SEAL team had been tracking a high-value target for 3 weeks through some of the most dangerous terrain in the region. Morrison was no ordinary soldier. At 42, he had survived more combat missions than most men could count. His steel-gray eyes had seen the worst of human conflict, yet they still held the spark of someone who believed in protecting the innocent. The team called him Iron Mike, not just for his unwavering determination, but for his ability to carry wounded comrades to safety when everyone else had given up hope. The mission briefing had been straightforward on paper. Intelligence suggested that a terrorist cell was planning a major attack on a nearby village. The cell leader, known only as the Shadow, had been responsible for dozens of civilian deaths across the region. Local forces had tried and failed to locate him multiple times. Now it was up to Morrison's 8-man team to end this threat once and for all. As the team moved through the rocky terrain under cover of darkness, Morrison felt the familiar weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Each of his men trusted him completely. Sergeant Rodriguez, the team's medic, had saved Morrison's life in Iraq 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Barnes, fresh out of training but sharp as a blade, looked up to Morrison like a father figure. These weren't just soldiers under his command. They were his brothers. The desert wind carried strange sounds that night. Morrison had learned to trust his instincts over 2 decades of military service, and something felt different about this mission. The intelligence seemed too clean, too convenient. But orders were orders, and innocent lives hung in the balance. The team pressed forward, unaware that they were walking into the deadliest trap of their careers. Hours passed as they navigated through narrow valleys and steep cliffs. The terrain was more challenging than expected, forcing them to take longer routes and use more energy than planned. By dawn, they were behind schedule but still determined to complete their objective. Morrison made the decision to continue despite the risks of operating in daylight. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, the world exploded around them. The trap had been set perfectly. Hidden explosives detonated simultaneously from multiple directions, creating a deadly crossfire that left the team pinned down with nowhere to run. Morrison watched in horror as his men fell one by one. Rodriguez took shrapnel to the chest while trying to reach a wounded teammate. Barnes disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris when a rocket-propelled grenade struck the rock formation he was using for cover. The sounds of gunfire and explosions mixed with the screams of his dying brothers, creating a symphony of devastation that would echo in Morrison's mind forever. Fighting through his own injuries, Morrison tried desperately to organize a defense. Blood streamed down his face from a head wound and his left arm hung useless at his side. But his training and determination kept him moving, kept him fighting. He managed to drag 2 wounded teammates behind a large boulder. But the enemy fire was too intense to mount any kind of effective counterattack. As the hours passed, Morrison realized with growing despair that no rescue was coming. Their radio had been destroyed in the initial blast, and their extraction point was miles away through hostile territory. One by one, his remaining teammates succumbed to their wounds despite his desperate attempts to keep them alive. By sunset, Master Chief Jake Morrison found himself alone in the desert, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen brothers. With enemy forces closing in from all sides, the legend of Iron Mike was about to face its greatest test. Buried beneath the weight of failure and bleeding from wounds that went far deeper than flesh, Morrison's world had become a nightmare of pain and survival. The first night alone was the hardest he had ever endured. Every sound in the darkness could mean death. Every shadow might hide an enemy fighter. His left shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and the gash across his forehead had clotted but still seeped blood whenever he moved too quickly. The bodies of his teammates lay scattered around the small valley where they had made their final stand. Morrison knew he should move, should try to escape, but he couldn't bring himself to leave them behind. These men had families, wives, children, who were probably sitting down to dinner at that very moment, unaware that their fathers and husbands would never come home again. Using his good arm, Morrison began the grim task of gathering identification tags and personal effects. Rodriguez had carried a photo of his newborn daughter in his vest pocket. The picture was now stained with blood, but the baby's smile was still visible. Barnes had a letter from his mother that he read every night before sleep. Morrison carefully folded it and placed it with the other items he would need to return to grieving families. Water became his first concern as the second day dawned. His canteen had been punctured by shrapnel and held only a few sips. The desert sun was already climbing toward its merciless peak, and Morrison knew that dehydration would kill him faster than any enemy bullet. He remembered his survival training and began looking for signs of underground water sources. The enemy patrols came twice that day. Morrison pressed himself against the rocky walls of a narrow crevice, holding his breath as voices passed just feet from his hiding spot. His service weapon had only 3 rounds left, and he was saving them for a final stand if capture seemed inevitable. The thought of being taken alive and tortured for information made his blood run cold. By the 3rd day, Morrison was barely clinging to consciousness. Fever from his infected wounds made him see things that weren't there. Sometimes he thought he heard Rodriguez calling for medical supplies, or Barnes asking for coordinates to the extraction point. The boundary between reality and hallucination began to blur as his body fought a losing battle against infection and exposure. It was during one of these fevered episodes that Morrison made a discovery that would save his life. While seeking shelter from the afternoon heat, he found a small cave hidden behind fallen rocks. Inside, ancient carvings on the walls told stories of travelers who had used this place for shelter over centuries. More importantly, at the back of the cave, a tiny spring bubbled up from deep underground. The water was warm and tasted of minerals, but it was clean and life-giving. Morrison drank slowly at first, letting his body adjust, then began the process of cleaning his wounds properly for the first time since the attack. The cool darkness of the cave provided relief from the burning sun and a defensible position where he could rest without fear of being spotted. As night fell on his 3rd day alone, Morrison forced himself to face the truth of his situation. No rescue team was coming because no one knew where he was. The mission had been classified, and the timeline for their return allowed for several more days before anyone would officially list them as overdue. Even then, searching this vast desert would take weeks, and by that time he would be long dead. But Jake Morrison had not earned his reputation by giving up when things looked impossible. As he sat in the ancient cave, surrounded by the carved stories of other survivors, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not die in this place. He would not let his teammates' sacrifice be meaningless. Somehow, some way, he would find the strength to honor their memory by surviving. The infection in his shoulder was spreading, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each passing hour. His ammunition was nearly gone, his food had run out the day before, and the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. But deep in his core, the fire that had carried him through 2 decades of impossible missions still burned bright. Morrison spent that night planning his escape route and saying goodbye to his fallen brothers one final time. By dawn, he would begin the most dangerous journey of his life, carrying nothing but an iron will and the desperate hope that somewhere beyond the horizon, help might still find him. Morrison left the cave before sunrise on the 4th day, knowing it might be his last chance to move before the infection took him completely. His left arm was now useless, hanging in a makeshift sling he had fashioned from Rodriguez's medical bandages. The fever came and went in waves, sometimes leaving him clear-headed, other times making him stumble like a drunk man through the rocky terrain. He had studied the stars during his long nights in the cave, using navigation skills learned in his earliest military training, to plot a course toward the nearest known friendly outpost. The journey would take him across 40 miles of some of the most hostile desert on Earth, through territory controlled by the same fighters who had killed his team. The first day of walking nearly broke him. Every step sent shockwaves of pain through his infected shoulder, and the desert heat seemed determined to cook him alive inside his tactical gear. But Morrison had learned long ago that the human body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. He focused on taking one step, then another, creating a rhythm that carried him forward even when conscious thought became impossible. Water remained his constant concern. The small amount he had been able to carry from the cave would last perhaps 2 days if he rationed it carefully. Morrison knew he would need to find more sources along the way, or risk dying of thirst within sight of rescue. He began traveling during the cooler hours before dawn and after sunset, hiding in whatever shade he could find during the brutal midday heat. On the 6th day, delirium took hold completely. Morrison found himself having conversations with teammates who had died 3 days earlier. Barnes walked beside him for hours discussing their plans for leave time back home. Rodriguez kept checking Morrison's wounds and adjusting his bandages, offering medical advice in his familiar Brooklyn accent. The hallucinations were so vivid that Morrison sometimes forgot they weren't real. It was during one of these episodes that Morrison walked straight into an enemy patrol. 3 fighters were resting in the shade of a large rock formation when the fevered SEAL stumbled into their midst. For a moment, everyone froze in surprise. Then training took over, and Morrison's body moved with deadly precision despite his weakened state. His last 3 bullets found their targets before the enemy could fully react. The brief firefight left Morrison with 2 assault rifles and fresh water, but also announced his presence to anyone within miles. He knew that more patrols would come looking for their missing comrades, turning his already desperate journey into a race against time. The weight of the extra weapons slowed him down, but Morrison couldn't bring himself to abandon them. The ammunition might mean the difference between life and death in another encounter. He fashioned a crude drag system using rifle slings and began pulling the weapons behind him across the sand, leaving a clear trail that enemy trackers could follow with ease. By the 7th day, Morrison's world had shrunk to a tunnel of pain and determination. His infected shoulder had swollen to twice its normal size, and red streaks were climbing up his neck toward his heart. Blood poisoning was setting in, and he knew that even if rescue came now, he might not survive long enough to receive proper medical treatment. But something miraculous happened that evening as Morrison collapsed behind a cluster of weathered boulders. Through his fever-clouded vision, he saw lights moving in the distance. At first he thought it was another hallucination, but these lights moved in a pattern too organized to be imaginary. They swept back and forth across the desert floor with the systematic precision of a search operation. Morrison tried to stand, tried to signal, but his body had finally reached its limits. His legs buckled and he fell face first into the sand. The infection had won its race against his iron will, and consciousness began to slip away like water through his fingers. His last clear thought was a prayer that someone would find his body and return Rodriguez's daughter's photo to her mother. The lights continued their methodical search pattern, growing closer with each sweep. Morrison lay motionless in the sand, his breathing shallow and labored, unaware that his legend was about to be reborn through the dedication of brothers he had never met, but who would never abandon one of their own. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had been running search and rescue operations for 6 years, but she had never seen anything like the mission that landed on her desk that Tuesday morning. A SEAL team had missed their extraction window by 4 days, and satellite intelligence suggested they had encountered significant resistance in a remote sector of the desert. The odds of finding survivors after this much time were virtually zero. But SEALs never left their own behind. Chen's 12-man rescue team had been searching for 18 hours straight when Petty Officer Martinez spotted something unusual through his night vision scope. At first it looked like scattered equipment, but as they moved closer, the horrific truth became clear. They had found the aftermath of Morrison's final battle, where 8 brave men had made their last stand against impossible odds. The scene was devastating. Bodies lay where they had fallen, their positions telling the story of a desperate fight against overwhelming force. Chen's team moved carefully through the area, checking for signs of life while documenting everything for the investigation that would follow. It was Martinez who noticed that something was wrong with the body count. According to the mission files, 9 men had gone out on this operation, but they had only found 8 bodies. Chen quickly organized her team to search the surrounding area, looking for any trace of the missing SEAL. What they found instead was a blood trail leading away from the battle site. Too old to follow directly, but clear evidence that someone had survived the initial attack. The trail led to a small cave where they discovered signs of recent habitation. Medical supplies had been used, and scratches on the cave walls showed where someone had been tracking the passage of days. Most telling was a small pile of personal effects carefully arranged on a flat stone. Identification tags and personal items that had clearly been gathered from fallen teammates with military precision. Chen realized they were tracking a survivor, someone who had lived through the massacre and was trying to make his way to safety. She immediately expanded the search pattern, but the desert was vast and the trail was already days old. Standard protocol would be to call for additional resources and organize a grid search that could take weeks to complete. But Chen had read the files on Master Chief Morrison, and she knew they weren't dealing with an ordinary soldier. This was a man who had survived impossible situations before, a legend among the SEAL community, whose exploits were still talked about in training schools. If anyone could survive alone in hostile territory for a week, it would be Iron Mike Morrison. The rescue team pushed deeper into the desert, following Morrison's likely route toward the nearest friendly outpost. They moved fast but carefully, knowing that enemy patrols were still active in the area. Chen split her team into 3 groups to cover more ground, maintaining radio contact and coordinating their search pattern to maximize their chances of success. It was Sergeant Thompson's group that found the second battle site on the 7th night. 3 enemy fighters lay dead around a small rock formation, and the evidence suggested they had been killed by someone using military tactics and precision shooting. Fresh drag marks in the sand led away from the scene, along with blood droplets that were much more recent than anything they had found before. Chen's heart raced as she realized they were getting close. Morrison was still alive, still moving, but the amount of blood they were finding suggested he was in critical condition. She pushed her teams harder, knowing that every minute could be the difference between rescue and recovery of remains. The breakthrough came just after midnight, when Martinez picked up movement on his thermal imaging scope. A heat signature was crawling slowly across the desert floor about 2 miles ahead of their position. It was too small and moving too slowly to be an enemy patrol, but too large to be local wildlife. Chen's team moved quickly but quietly toward the contact. As they got closer, they could see it was a human figure dragging something behind him, moving with the determination of someone who refused to give up, despite devastating injuries. Through their night vision, they could see that his left arm was badly swollen and that he was leaving a clear blood trail in the sand. When they were 50 yards away, Chen made the decision to announce their presence. She couldn't risk Morrison mistaking them for enemy fighters and using his last strength to engage in a firefight. Her voice carried clearly across the still desert air as she called out the traditional SEAL greeting that would identify them as friends. Morrison's response was barely audible, but it was enough. He raised his good arm in acknowledgement before collapsing face first into the sand. Chen's team rushed forward, their medic already preparing emergency treatment for what looked like severe infection and blood loss. As they reached Morrison's position, Chen could see why he had been moving so slowly. He had been dragging 2 assault rifles behind him, unwilling to abandon the weapons even in his desperate condition. The legend of Iron Mike Morrison was far from over. As Chen's medic worked to stabilize his condition for evacuation, she realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. This man had survived a massacre, lived alone in hostile territory for a week, fought off enemy patrols, and crawled nearly 40 miles through the desert with life-threatening injuries. And he had done it all while carrying the personal effects of his fallen teammates, determined to bring them home one final time. The medical helicopter touched down at the field hospital, just as Morrison's heart stopped for the second time during the flight. Combat Medic Staff Sergeant Lisa Park had been fighting to keep him alive for the past 20 minutes, pushing IV fluids and antibiotics into his system while his blood pressure dropped to dangerous levels. The infection had spread throughout his body, and his organs were beginning to shut down from the massive trauma and blood loss. Dr. Michael Hassan had been the chief surgeon at this forward operating base for 8 months, and he had seen every type of combat injury imaginable. But Morrison's case was unlike anything in his experience. The man should have died days ago from his injuries, yet somehow his body had kept fighting long enough for rescue to find him. Hassan knew that saving this patient would require everything he had learned in 15 years of trauma surgery. The first surgery lasted 14 hours. Hassan and his team worked systematically through Morrison's injuries, cleaning infected tissue from his shoulder wound, repairing internal bleeding, and fighting the massive infection that threatened to kill him from within. The shoulder injury was the worst, with bone fragments embedded deep in the muscle and signs that gangrene had already begun to set in. Morrison flatlined 3 more times during that first surgery. Each time Hassan's team managed to restart his heart and pull him back from the edge of death. But the doctor knew they were fighting a losing battle against time and the massive trauma Morrison's body had endured. Even if they could control the infection, the blood loss and organ damage might be too severe for recovery. The second day brought new complications. Morrison's kidneys were failing from the infection, and his brain showed signs of swelling from prolonged fever and dehydration. Hassan made the difficult decision to place him in a medically induced coma, giving his body the best chance to heal without the stress of consciousness. The prognosis remained grim, and Hassan privately gave Morrison less than a 20% chance of survival. But Morrison's legend was built on defying impossible odds. Throughout the third day, his vital signs slowly began to stabilize. The massive doses of antibiotics were finally gaining ground against the infection, and his kidney function showed slight improvement. Hassan allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. The real crisis came on the fourth day when Morrison's body began rejecting the blood transfusions that were keeping him alive. His immune system, weakened by trauma and infection, was attacking the donated blood as if it were a foreign invader. Hassan's team had to find a rare blood type match while Morrison's blood count dropped to critical levels once again. It was Sergeant Park who solved the problem. After checking the records of every soldier on the base, she discovered that Lieutenant Chen, the rescue team leader who had found Morrison, was a perfect blood match. Chen immediately volunteered to donate as much blood as safely possible, joking that since she had found Morrison in the desert, she might as well help finish saving his life. The blood transfusion marked a turning point in Morrison's recovery. His color improved dramatically over the next few hours, and his brain swelling began to subside. Hassan made the decision to slowly reduce the sedation and see if Morrison could regain consciousness on his own. The process would be gradual and carefully monitored, but it represented the first real hope they had seen since his arrival. Morrison's family had been notified of his condition, but given the classified nature of his mission, they could only be told that he had been seriously injured in the line of duty. His wife Sarah flew to Germany, where Morrison would eventually be transferred for advanced treatment, not knowing whether she would find her husband alive or attend his funeral. As Morrison began the slow journey back to consciousness, Hassan reflected on what he had witnessed. This wasn't just a story of medical skill overcoming impossible odds. It was a testament to the human spirit's refusal to surrender, even when death seemed certain. Morrison had survived because giving up was simply not part of who he was. The infection was finally under control, his organs were functioning again, and his brain showed normal activity patterns. But Hassan knew that the hardest battles still lay ahead. Morrison would face months of rehabilitation, multiple surgeries to repair the damage to his shoulder, and the psychological trauma of losing his entire team. The man who woke up would be forever changed by what he had endured. On the seventh day after his rescue, Morrison's eyes finally opened. He was confused and disoriented, unable to speak because of the breathing tube that had kept him alive. But when Hassan explained where he was and what had happened, Morrison's first gesture was to touch his chest where he had kept his teammates' personal effects. Even in his weakened state, his first concern was for the men he had been unable to save. Hassan gently explained that the personal effects had been safely preserved and would be returned to the families as Morrison had intended. Tears ran down Morrison's face as he realized that his impossible journey through the desert had not been in vain. His brothers would go home to their families, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten. 3 months later, Morrison sat in a wheelchair on the deck of the military hospital in San Diego, watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. His left arm was still in a brace, and he would never regain full use of his shoulder. But he was alive. The doctors called it a miracle, but Morrison knew better. He had survived because 8 brave men had given their lives to buy him the precious time he needed to escape the desert. The funeral services had been the hardest part of his recovery. Morrison had insisted on attending each one, despite his doctor's concerns about his physical condition. He had personally returned Rodriguez's daughter's photo to her mother, handed Barnes's letter to his grieving parents, and delivered the personal effects of 6 other heroes to families who would treasure these final connections to their lost sons and husbands. The medal ceremony was scheduled for the following week. Morrison would receive the Navy Cross for his actions in the desert, but he had already made it clear that he considered the honor to belong to his fallen teammates. The citation would read like something from a legend, detailing his 7-day survival against impossible odds and his determination to bring his brothers home. But Morrison's thoughts were no longer focused on medals or recognition. Physical therapy consumed most of his days as he fought to regain strength and mobility. The doctors said he would make a full recovery eventually, though he would never again pass the physical requirements for active duty as a SEAL. After 22 years of service, Iron Mike Morrison's combat career was over. The transition to civilian life would be difficult for any warrior, but Morrison had discovered a new mission during his long recovery. The families of his fallen teammates had stayed in touch, and he had become a source of comfort and connection to their lost loved ones. Rodriguez's wife called him every week to talk about her daughter's first steps. Barnes's mother sent pictures of the memorial garden she had planted in her son's honor. Morrison began speaking at military training facilities, sharing his story not as a tale of individual heroism, but as a lesson about the bonds that held fighting men together, even in the face of death. He talked about the importance of never leaving a fallen comrade behind, about the responsibility that came with leadership, and about the price that freedom demanded from those who chose to defend it. The young SEALs who heard Morrison speak saw something in his eyes that couldn't be taught in any classroom. They saw the weight of command, the cost of survival, and the strength that came from knowing you had done everything possible to honor the memory of fallen brothers. Many of them would carry Morrison's words with them into their own battles in distant lands. Lieutenant Commander Chen visited Morrison regularly during his recovery. She had been promoted partly because of her successful rescue mission, but she always credited Morrison's survival instincts for making the rescue possible. Chen had become something of a legend herself, known throughout the Navy as the officer who had never given up on a missing SEAL. As Morrison watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and red, he thought about the desert where his old life had ended and his new one had begun. The nightmares still came sometimes, dreams of gunfire and explosions and the voices of dying men calling for help that would never arrive. But he had learned to carry that pain without letting it crush him. Sarah, his wife of 15 years, joined him on the deck with 2 cups of coffee. She had never asked for details about what happened in the desert, understanding that some wounds needed time to heal in private. But she had seen the change in her husband, the way he now treasured every ordinary moment as a gift that might not have been. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez's wife. Her daughter had taken her first steps that morning, and the attached video showed a laughing toddler stumbling across a living room toward her mother's outstretched arms. Morrison smiled and showed the video to Sarah, knowing that Rodriguez would have been bursting with pride to see his little girl reaching this milestone. The legend of Iron Mike Morrison would live on in the stories told by those who knew him, in the young warriors he inspired, and in the families who found comfort in his determination to honor their fallen heroes. He had been broken in the desert, buried under the weight of loss and failure and bleeding from wounds that went far deeper than flesh. But he had been found by brothers who refused to abandon one of their own. And in their dedication, he had discovered that some legends are too strong to die. As the last light faded from the western sky, Morrison squeezed his wife's hand and whispered a silent thank you to 8 men who would never see another sunset. Their sacrifice had given him this moment, this life, this chance to make their memory mean something more than just another casualty report filed away in some Pentagon basement. The legend would continue, carried forward by those who understood that heroes are not made by surviving the impossible, but by refusing to let the impossible break their spirit or diminish their love for the brothers who stand beside them in the darkness.